Hey everybody, Jem Schofield here, and welcome to the Canon EOS R5 and R6 video training series. The purpose of this series is to focus on the video-specific features of these cameras. And in this particular video, we're going to be talking about both the R5 and the R6 and the dual pixel CMOS AF2 features of those cameras. So let's go. Let's talk about the autofocus functionality of the R5 and R6 when in movie mode, and specifically the dual pixel CMOS AF2 system in the cameras. This information will apply to both the R5 and the R6, and what I want to do is give you some tips and best practices for setting up the cameras in the best way for using the AF system. So the first step, of course, is to make sure that your lens is set to AF. The next thing that we're going to do is go into the Shoot 8 menu, and under HDMI display, we want to make sure that we have dual display selected. And the reason we want to do that is when we are using an external monitor or an external monitor recorder, we still want to have the ability to have touch focus capability with the screen that is built into either of these cameras. Then we're going to go back into the menu, and we're going to take a trip over here to the Custom Function 3 page, and we're going to go to Customize Buttons. Now, inside of this menu, you'll see that on the left-hand side, we can customize buttons when we're in stills mode on the R5 or R6, and on the right side, in that column, we can customize buttons related to movie mode. I'm going to scroll down here to the bottom to the last two options, which are Set and Multi-Controller. I'm going to go over to this right column here, which again is for movie mode. And the first thing we're going to do is go into Set. So you can see here, I can assign that Set button to many different functions, but what I want to do is choose this option, which is Pause Movie Servo AF, which will effectively allow me to disable my autofocus anytime I press the Set button. And I'm just going to go ahead and choose that. So now we're going to go down to the multi-controller, and the other thing I want to do is make sure that I have this set to direct AF point selection. And with that selected, we're going to step out, and I'm just going to use the touch screen here to change our focus points. And then you'll see here that the multi-controller allows me to move around to different locations for my focus. And then I can press the Set button here, and you'll see this Movie Servo AF paused. And no matter what I'm doing, it's always keeping that focus on that particular point. You can see it's very faintly grayed out there. And then press Set again, and then I can change my focus point by moving it to somewhere else. So great functionality just by making those two little changes inside of the camera. And now we're going to go ahead and talk more about the different AF methods and how to access them. So I'm going to come out of that menu. So now we need to access our parameters for autofocus, and we can do that a number of different ways. The first way, if I just step out of the menus here, is to press the Q button on the back of the camera. And then when I do that and I go up here to the top left, we can see our autofocus capabilities that are available to us inside of the camera. The second way we can access our AF point selection is with the AF point selection button here on the top right of the camera. So I'll press that, and I can either use the touch screen to select those, or I can use this dial on the top right of the camera. And this is really the way, either the Q menu or the AF point selection button, that you're probably going to be accessing those AF options in the camera when you're shooting. When we go into the menu here, it's really over here under AF where we can dig a little bit deeper in terms of the options that we're choosing. So you can see here under AF method, I can still get to, again, a third way, those AF methods in the camera system. And for instance here, the first choice is face tracking plus tracking. So this would be if you're trying to detect faces, either on people or animals, or if you're tracking a particular thing that you select inside of your frame. Then we have spot AF, we have 1-point AF, expanded AF area, we have an even larger area that it's going to try to latch onto. And then we basically have these different zone AFs where we have them in different sizes. If we choose and set zone AF, you can see that when I step out of here and I'm choosing that, we have a rather large box here where we can choose a particular area of the frame to have autofocus. If I go back into the menu and we choose, let's say for instance, spot AF, you'll see that when we step out that we have a much smaller AF point here when we are choosing something to latch our autofocus on. But we have a lot of other options inside of these menus, specifically on pages 1 and 3, where we're going to make changes having to do with how you want your AF system to function. So under page 1, what we now want to talk about is movie servo AF. If we have that disabled inside of the menu, you'll see that when I press on a particular area, that we do not get autofocus immediately. I actually have to reach over and press down the shutter halfway, and then we will get focus on that particular area. If I go back into the menu and I turn Movie Servo AF on again and enable that, you'll see that I don't have to press the shutter for the AF to activate. Okay, back into the menu here, we're going to go up to the top to AF method again. And one of the things I want to point out is if you have any other of these options selected, except for our face plus tracking, you will see, and I'll select this one here, that eye detection is disabled. So I'm going to go in here and choose that face plus tracking, and you'll see that eye detection is now enabled. We'll go into subject to detect, and we have 3 options: people, animals, or no priority. So it'll still try to track onto particular faces, but it's not a preference of people or animals. I'm going to set that to people for now. And then we can choose eye detection to be disabled or enabled. And again, it is dependent upon having the face plus tracking option enabled in AF method. And I'm going to turn this on usually when I'm using face tracking in the camera, because I want to make sure that the eyes are in focus. And then the last thing we're going to talk about here is a little bit hard to demonstrate, but I'll talk you through it a little bit, which is the touch and drag AF settings. Now, if I turn this on and enable it, when we do this, what we're doing is we're allowing this back screen of the R5 or the R6 to be used to get focus when you're using the viewfinder. So when you're in that position and the viewfinder is activated, then you will be able to use this function. And basically, I'm just going to put my hand over the sensor here. This now becomes your focusing mechanism, if you want it to be, when you're using the viewfinder. And it's pretty powerful. You're going to get this little round circle. It's really 2 semicircles with a space that is vertical. And when you are moving around with your finger, you can actually change where your focus is while you're using the viewfinder. So when you're in situations where there's tons of ambient light and you'd like to rely on the viewfinder as opposed to the back screen, you can still use touch focus capabilities. Now we have a couple of other things that we can change inside of here. Number 1 has to do with positioning method. You have absolute or relative. Let's talk about relative first. What's basically happening is when we say relative, no matter where we press on the screen here, we'll have a very small defined area that will allow you to move that point all over your entire image. And we have almost 100% coverage with this dual pixel CMOS AF2 on these cameras. When we set this to absolute, then absolute means that it is mapping based on this entire image area over here. So if I press here, that's where my focus point's going to be. If I press down here, that's where the focus point's going to be. So again, if I wanted to focus in the top right of my image and I was looking in the viewfinder, I would press here. If I wanted the center of the image, I would press here. If I wanted the bottom center, I would press there. And it's actually activating that AF. And you can see that as actually happening over here on this screen, because I'm effectively activating the viewfinder. So again, a little hard to demo, but just giving you that information so you have it. And then lastly, what's the active touch area on the screen? For me personally, I like to use the whole panel, but some people may not. So I'm going to go over here and just show you your options. You can make the right part of the screen, the left part, the top, the bottom, the top right, the bottom right, the top left, the bottom left. So you can really customize this in terms of where you want that active area. If I personally were going to use something other than whole panel, then that's where I would be more inclined to set my positioning method to relative as opposed to absolute. Okay, that should give you enough of an overview of that functionality. Let's step out of this menu, and we're now going to go over to the third menu for AF3, and we're going to take a look at some of the other options that are available to you when you're using AF in the camera, when you're shooting in movie/video mode. So when we go into this menu, what we're effectively doing is we are deciding that when we change our AF point, how fast we want that to occur. And this will be somewhat dependent upon the lenses that you're using, but if you have a lens with fast AF, then you can really take advantage of this feature. Now we can activate that as something that's always on, my preference, because I can see how it's going to function even when I'm not recording, or only active when you are recording. And you can see that based on these different options, for instance here, I can change it to during shooting and then reduce my AF speed here to a -5 to be very slow. So when I'm testing it, before rolling camera, I'm just going to see a standard change. Now for me, again, I really want to see what's going to happen before I start shooting. So I'm going to generally put this to always on. And this is especially useful when you want a more realistic transition between two focus points. When we're manually focusing between 2 points, even if we're using the focus guide, which I cover in another video in the series, it's not generally instantaneous. So by setting your autofocus to being a little slower, that transition is going to be more realistic, especially for those rack focuses. And you can see here that as I'm transitioning from that chart to the camera in the front, that it's a nice transition. Let's just go ahead and take a look at that again. And here we are coming back to the camera. And it's a much more natural transition. You're going to have to test this for your various shooting scenarios and then choose the AF speed setting that's right for that particular project and what you're doing. So the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is Movie Servo AF track sensitivity. And this is a little bit different than AF speed. So if we have something that's selected somewhere in the frame and then other objects come into that same space or other subjects, how fast or how responsive is the camera going to be in locking onto those new subjects or new objects? And sometimes you don't want it to be responsive at all. For instance, you're locked onto a person, something crosses the frame, and you don't want it to latch onto that other thing that's in the frame in that same place in the frame. So by going into the menu here, we can change that sensitivity. So if we want it to stay locked onto our subject matter or the object that we have in the frame in that place, we would change that to a negative value. And then of course, if we wanted the AF system to latch onto something that was coming into that same part of the frame more quickly, we would set it to be more responsive. So of course, with all of this AF functionality inside of these cameras, it's going to be you who are going to find the settings that work best for your particular projects. I personally like to change my sensitivity to a lower value to be more locked on. I like to change my AF speed to a lower value so that my transitions are a little bit slower and I think a little bit more realistic to the way an operator would be using a camera if it was in a manual focus mode. But you're going to have to test all of this functionality on your projects and set the cameras to your preferences for your productions. So there you have it. That's an overview of the dual pixel CMOS AF2 features in both the R5 and R6 cameras, and hopefully that will help you going forward with your productions. The goal here is always education, so I hope you learned something in this video. Thanks for watching.